live chat show. I am your host, Jack McLean, and today my guest is Nathan Spencer, who's currently the Senior Strength and Conditioning Coach at the New South Wales Institute of Sport. And our key topic of today's chat will be around adaptability and the key strength and conditioning staff's trait for working in elite sport. Before we start this episode, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show your support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Welcome, Nathan. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
Thanks, mate. I appreciate it. Looking forward to the next bit of time and going through a few different bits and pieces. So, yeah, thanks for inviting me on. No,
thank you for coming on. And, yeah, likewise, really looking forward to our chat and to dive into the details like the topic that you mentioned in terms of adaptability and how important that is for strength and conditioning coaches. But before we do, mate, for those that aren't aware of your work, can you provide us a quick update on your background in strength and conditioning and elite sport?
Yeah, for sure. As you said, currently one of three senior S&Cs here at the New South Wales Institute of Sport, headed up by head of the whole department, Alex Natera, who I think his work kind of needs no introduction, and Simon Harries, head of S&C, who spent a lot of time in the AFL spaces and rugby sevens and NRL as well. But like most of us, failed athletes, not very good, not as motivated as what I probably needed to be. But knew I wanted to work in this industry in some way, shape or form. And university, Bachelor of Ex-Phys at UNSW, worked actually as a clinical EP for a few years whilst also doing, honorarium, volunteer positions, and eventually into some paid work in a couple of NRL clubs, West Tigers and St George Illawarra Dragons. And the Dragons job was sort of my first, full-time, reasonably well paid position. And then sort of after that, was completing my master's of high performance sport through ACU as I think one of the first cohorts to go through that program, and got a lot out of that and met some incredible people who were doing just amazing things in our spaces at a whole different number of levels, both domestically, internationally, academia, pro, elite, semi-elite spaces, really pushing the limits of what we do as in high performance sport. And that during that time made the transition into the NBL to work with Illawarra Hawks, and that was in conjunction with a private facility, Bay Med Performance, who had the contract for the medical side of things with the Illawarra Hawks in the NBL, and so those two ran kind of nicely. And then was introed through mutual connections to that master's program to Dave Tenney, who became my boss when I made the jump in 2018 to work overseas in the States, initially as performance and rehab coach for the Orlando Magic in the NBA. And then after 18 months, I moved into the head of S&C role there. And then, just recently, just come back. So July this year, just July 2022, made the transition back to Australia and now here at NSWIS, and honestly, just I've really loved the change and embracing it, and really enjoying my time here. Some good work with some really, really good people, both within the S&C department or the performance support services, and a couple of really, really good coaches as well in the women's water polo program. So enjoying that at the moment, and that's kind of, I guess, a quick 5-minute summary of my career to date, I guess.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, mate. And no doubt you've had some strong influences and mentors along the way during that journey, working in different codes and now in the institute setting as well. Who have been some strong influences and how have they sort of impacted your philosophy, if you like?
I've tried to draw from a lot of people at all different levels in everything that I've been in every role that I've ever had. So going back very early on to as an intern, I can still remember some key things from the late Sean Burns, who was the head of strength and conditioning at the West Tigers at the time, and Tim Sheens as an NRL coach was outstanding, and Todd Payton, who at that time was still playing, but has transitioned into a coaching role and was now the head coach at the North Queensland Cowboys. And, Toddy's philosophy on coaching and his approach with his players, I think is second to none. And a lot of the staff at the club there, Balin Couples, who's at the New Zealand Warriors, Ben Rogers, who is head of recruitment and development now at the Parramatta Eels. Those guys have all been pretty instrumental in me early on, and coaches I worked with then at the time, Chris Bradbury, Shane Sultana, Andrew Webster, were all really, really good to work with. And then transitioning into basketball and into the Dragons, people are still, all these people still to this day I keep in touch with and bounce ideas off, and just happy to grab a coffee and grab a beer and those types of things. But Dan Lawson, Scott Mutton, Rob Beveridge, Kieran Howell at Catapult, who was great for me with some research stuff. And then more recently, Dave Tenney, Luke Story, Matt Taberner, Bryce Murphy in the States, and even in other spaces like Adam Waterson, who's the head of S&C at LA Galaxy, another Aussie, and Alex Calder, who's a fellow Aussie working in MLS, they're sharing some similar sort of life experiences and cultural adaptations, and just going through those things together has been really quite nice. And then I guess more recently, obviously Alex Natera, Simon Harries, Shane Lahan from the Sydney Swans, and the coaching staff here, Rebecca Rippon at the moment, learning a hell of a lot from her in regards to women's water polo, as a two-time Olympian ex-athlete, and having never worked with Olympic athletes, I'm learning a lot from her, and she's great to bounce ideas off. But then, you think back to athletes that you've worked with as well, and sort of things that you've shared with them. And I've learned some hard lessons, some very important lessons that I think that they've taught me more than I have taught them. The rewards and the highlights, I guess, then, or who's influenced some of the things that I've done, I think back to athletes that I've worked with very early on in academy pathway programs in the rugby league spaces, and seeing guys like Mitchell Moses, Luke Brooks, progress and play first grade, Ray Stone, Tom Freebarn, the Sirenan brothers, Matt Duffy, Adam Clune, all these kids who you've had when they're 15, 16 through to 20 years of age, and they're playing and they're established first grade players is really rewarding. And then, in the basketball setting, guys like Nick Vucevic, two-time All-Star, and Markel Fultz have been pretty influential on me in developing thoughts and ideas around just athlete management. So they're probably some of the bigger ones that spring to mind when you ask that question.
Yeah, it's a good segue, mate, into the next one in terms of highlights. Like what spring up to mind when you reflect back over your career, and moments that you're really proud of to be a part of working elite sport.
There's obviously the big ones that are sort of publicly recognized with major team wins that you're involved with. And for me, the highlight, I was very fortunate that my time in Orlando, I was a part of the staff that was successful in breaking a pretty lengthy playoff drought. So to be a part of that was really quite tremendous. It wasn't necessarily the first in both years, the playoff series that was memorable, but it was game 81 when we played. We were in 9th position and we needed to win one of the last 2 games in order to clinch a playoff spot. And it was either for 7th or 8th. And we needed a couple of results to go away if we lost game 81. And we're playing against Boston in Boston, who were good at the time. Kyrie Irving, Jason Tatum, Enes Kanter was at the center, I think. Marcus Smart, like they had an incredible roster. A large portion of the team they had then, they went on to obviously win the Eastern Conference last year and push the Warriors to a pretty tight playoff finals campaign. But being involved in that night, and one of the unfortunate things about the NBA environment is you move on to the next game so quickly that you don't have a chance to sort of reflect. And it's a great teaching point because you have to forget and just move on to the next thing. But that night, winning in Boston, Evan Fournier with a really clutch play, just a really ballsy play, drive to the rim, draw through contact, and that was kind of and get the bucket. And that was a nail in the coffin. We knew we had him with a few seconds to go, and the elation that night, the players, the staff, and everybody celebrating together. Just we went to a crappy little dive bar around the corner and just had pizzas and a couple of beers, and just all coaching staff just in one room celebrating just the elation, the joy, and knowing that collectively we're working towards one goal, and that was the goal for that year, and we had achieved it. We still wanted to do more, which we weren't successful with. We lost out the first round of the playoffs to the Toronto Raptors, who won it that season, but that was a big one. And then as I touched on previously, just seeing those young athletes transition and to achieve their goals is always a highlight for me. And it's something I'm really enjoying now, working with the water polo program. Is my goal, my sole job responsibility really is to help put these athletes in positions to make Olympic teams and be successful Olympic campaigns. So going through goal setting processes with them and challenging them, and having the luxury now to have individual projects with the athletes where they can pose really challenging questions to me on how I can help them. That's something that I'm really, really embracing and trying to take those learning experiences from previous environments and to apply them here. And then there's also the injury side of things. When you work with athletes who have been out for an incredibly long period of time for any particular injury, and you see them make returns, and while their immediate impact might not necessarily be successful as far as, points scored or whatever, but just seeing their elation and that sense of accomplishment when they get back onto the field or the court or in the pool or whatever it may be, and that they're actually able to participate and play the sport that they love. And in the pro setting, there are some athletes who do it because they're good at it and they get paid a lot of money for it. And there are some, more so than others, who do it because they love it. And when you see those athletes get back to doing what they do and what they do best, knowing that you're a part of that journey in some way, shape or form is always fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, mate. Mentioned hard lessons, and in terms of challenges that you've faced, no doubt there's a fair few, and there's pressure that comes with elite sport. But what are some challenges that you faced, and feel free to sort of share, I guess, stories that you're comfortable with sharing in a public format. But big challenges that you faced, and how have you grown from facing them?
It's a big thing, in my opinion, and it kind of, I guess, forms a basis of the key part of what we're obviously going to talk about, being adaptable as an S&C, but I think that also speaks to being adaptable as a human being. A big part of that for me has been actually embracing change and not fearing change. And the way I view that now is that every opportunity, every change that we're presented with is just another opportunity to solve a problem, in my opinion. And there was someone actually who has been incredibly influential in my thought processes, not necessarily just hard skill development, but in how I tackle and solve problems, as a clinical psychologist who was a part of the staff in Orlando, who was great for me as a sounding board, Dr. Joe Corella. His golden line to me was that it's us against the problem, not you against me, in solving a problem. And I think that's where we can get a little bit where conflict can arise in pro settings, and there's challenges of philosophies and those types of things. But at the end of the day, that the problem that we're all trying to solve is probably the same thing, and you may have a different way to do it, and I may. And that's not to say one way is better than the other. They're just different. And as soon as we have that mentality that, okay, it's you with me against something else, that sort of, I think, changes our mindset. So there's been a lot of challenges that I've been faced with that, when I've adopted that mindset, have actually become so much easier to overcome. The biggest things that spring to mind as far as just overall challenges are concerned has been relocating to the US and accepting a role where a dream opportunity to work with an NBA franchise, and you think about the names that the Magic have produced: Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, um, you know, and even the guys now that are there, Nick Vucevic, Tracy McGrady. There's an illustrious, illustrious amount of names that come through from a pretty prestigious organization, and so to be a part of that was just so exciting. But when I moved, being aware of the cultural differences just within the US, and how the organizations are run differently, and if I had my time over, I would definitely go back and create more of an awareness and educate myself on some of those things. And I think a part of that too has also then shaped my perception, and my perception has changed on what our role as practitioners is. I think very early on, or even senior practitioners, we have a belief, or a big part of our philosophy is that we are the biggest part of the program. It's definitely, in my opinion, not the case, and that our role, we're in the service industry, whereas we're performance support first and foremost. And that as I've moved into different positions and become, more of in somewhat of a leadership position in different ways, leadership can be either, you can be a cowboy or a shepherd. Sometimes there's a combination of both, but I think that approach can be taken, can be applied to what we do as S&Cs. You're either a cowboy where it's my way or the highway, or if you're confident in what you know, and we should be confident in what we know, we should have a very diverse array of tools, and we should have a great breadth and depth of knowledge. And if we're well versed in all those different facets of strength and conditioning, then we should be confident and comfortable in what we're doing, and we should actually be able to be more of a shepherd than a cowboy, in my opinion. Being fired, that's happened to all of us, or it will happen to all of us, just a part of our industry, especially in the pro and elite setting. Early on in your career, when that happens and you're faced with the decision of, do I stay and pursue a career in an industry that's very volatile, or do I leave and pursue it in the non-professional or non-elite setting and work in the private spaces, or do I go and apply it in something else, or go to the academic route, or whatever it may be? That's always a challenge, and I'm very happy with my decision there to stay in and do it when those things were faced. I was faced with those challenges, because I'm very happy with where I am at the moment and what I'm doing, and I love my job. I love what I do. And then more recently, especially over the past sort of 4 to 5 years, is the challenge for me has been establishing a work-life balance. And I don't think there ever is a balance. I think there's a give or take, and it's a bit of a seesaw. And in previous role, it was definitely work over the work side. So work was dominating the life side of things. I think as you get older and your appreciation for what's important and what you value as a person maybe changes, the goalposts for you change, and that's where your career trajectory may change and those types of things. So for me, just being comfortable with that, embracing it, and accepting that I'm where I am, and I'm really happy doing what I'm doing. And it could be very easy for people, especially young practitioners, to get hung up on, I want to work or I need to work in this space to be successful. When the reality is that there's a very finite amount of jobs in the professional elite spaces, but where the really good work exists and where you can actually make a lot of change is in semi-pro developmental spaces, where maybe the financial reward and money and resources in those programs may not be as great, but the impact you have is actually, or could be, far greater. So I think if you adjust your mindset there, you can have a huge impact on those things.
Yeah, Oh, thanks for sharing, mate. That's such a great insight and into no doubt what was a significant change in relocating and then working in such a big sport, probably the top as high as it gets in terms of NBA. You mentioned that if you had your time again, some preparation in terms of understanding the nuance and the culture. How do you think you would do that? Is that speaking to practitioners that are in the NBA, or for those that maybe are listening that are facing that current opportunity of relocation and significant change, what would you do specifically?
I spoke to practitioners at the time, largely in the S&C realms,
Yep.
and they gave me some really good advice that I tried to implement. One lesson came and bit me on the backside a little bit there, but my initial role was performance and rehab coach, which I think if you're in an AFL club, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're the bridge between, physio and S&C and late stage rehab, and you're probably S&C trained, but have a better understanding of loading adaptations to specific injuries and, probably a better hard skill set in some of the sports sciences and data manipulation and those types of things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you take that role and you apply it in a US setting where you have athletic trainers, physical therapists, strength coaches. There's a lot of crossover between those disciplines. So for me, not even being familiar with what an athletic trainer and a physical therapist was, and then trying to establish what my role actually was as a performance and rehab coach when it crossed over with a lot of that. And then also into S&C, you've then got 4 practitioners dealing with injury management strategies rather than maybe 2.
Yeah, right.
So I think that challenge specifically was quite unique because the role was unique. But if I had my time over again, I would definitely go through and look at, what's the organizational structure of the team that you're going to work in? Where does my role sit within that? Who are the people that are there? What are their background and experiences? I worked with practitioners who would come from private setting, from collegiate setting, where they had worked with as a sole practitioner in athletic training. They had taken athletes from day 0 all the way through to end stage rehab, return to play. So they were accustomed to going through the whole process. Then you had PTs who were involved in certain parts of rehab. So getting a better understanding of just those things, I think, would have been a huge help for me, just to have have better conversations earlier on. Mm-hmm. Would be the big thing there.
Yep. And in terms of adaptability for those that haven't worked in elite sport yet, what would be some, do's and equally some don'ts? So for someone that is really rigid and trying to work in a team, how does that show up in a team format where you're trying to collaborate? That can be a bit of an issue for a high performance team, do you think?
The first thing there, I think, is to ask the question of their perspective on things to gain an insight as to their thought processes, and secondly, make sure that the goal or the obstacle that you're trying to pivot around is really well defined. Because if it's not, and your interpretation of what we're trying to achieve versus my interpretation of what we're trying to achieve are 2 different things, well, then never going to work together. We're never going to work efficiently together. Whereas if we're clearly aligned on what the end goal is, I think that's half the battle. And in rehab cases specifically, when you have practitioners who, and the easiest example here is take a surgeon with an ACL. Their role is to repair the ACL. What they do once they're sewn back up and is manage some swelling and pain and discharge and hand off to medical staff. They'll check back in, but as far as the day-to-day management is concerned and any clinical outcomes, like, they're not going to have a huge impact on what actually they care, but they don't actually have control on what happens on the day-to-day. Mm-hmm. So their objectives versus our objectives as staff are totally different. So having those things, established and understanding that this is the surgeon's expectations, These are the physio's expectations. This is the coach's expectations of where they want them to come back in, and just having that really well defined, I think would be really, really important. And then having a process to identify what you need to work around. I think early on you need to think more consciously about that, but then as you're faced with more and more challenges, and you need to be adaptable and pivot in your decision-making skills. We need to be critical thinkers. That starts to become heuristic, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for that, from a rehab sense, and then from a performance point of view, you mentioned you went into that head S&C role, where I imagine you start to work closely with the coaches, planning training, and so forth. Equally, that same question went from when working with coaches, that maybe they're focusing on their side, and then there's the physical side. Is it the same process? Find out where they're coming from, what their end goal is, and try and make that aligned with the physical goal when you're working.
Yeah, definitely. In an NBA setting, you don't work strictly with the head coach, because the coaching staff is so large. So, I mean, the performance staff there's 15 players. The performance staff is 11 or 12. So it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio, and your coaching staff is nearly 20.
Wow.
So the approach that most organizations will take will be a team of teams approach, where the head coach sort of sits above everybody, and so does a performance director. And there's pods of staff that are responsible for the development, physical, tactical, skill acquisition, cognitive, for every athlete. So, assistant coaches or S&Cs or whatever it may be, potentially different philosophies, but same outcomes. But then that obviously comes back from the head coach and also management on what they're trying to work on, and where they deem improvement, what areas of improvement they think are obviously critical for the athletes and where they are in their careers and everything. I think in settings here where the number of staff and ratio of staff to athlete is considerably different, then you have more involvement with head coaches and those types of things. And also the other thing in that, specifically with NBA, is you play every 2 days. So you actually don't train. There's no practices. Your practices are your shoot arounds, and they're tactical. You're going through play structures of what you're doing for that evening. Very, very infrequently are actually getting through any scrimmages and those types of things. So, and I think that question that you just asked there was my mindset of, okay, this is how it worked in NRL. This is how it worked in NBL, because you play 1, maybe 2 games a week, where you're constantly communicating with head coach on training plan, volumes, intensities, what you want guys to be working towards, and how to manipulate drills and everything, with the end goal to win games. It's the same goal, just in an 82-game season, but your constraints that you're working in are very, very different. So being able to shift your thinking and, okay, how do we still achieve those goals, and how do I work with people I'm working with, just needs to be fluid, and again, just solve those problems.
Yep. And it's a challenging one to answer, but how do you have awareness around whether you need to be adaptable, or the person in front of you needs to be adaptable? Maybe when you're now in a leadership position or managerial, position, maybe giving feedback to someone who's working under you, or vice versa, someone who's above you. How do you sort of navigate through that?
That's a really, really good question. If that was me now, the first question I'm asking myself is, how do I contribute to the problem? And have I done all I can to minimize my contribution to that problem? Because I think it's, unfortunately, this isn't just of us as practitioners in high performance sport, but I think just in society in general, we're a blame culture first. So if something goes wrong, it's quite easy just to point the finger and say that you're not pulling your weight, or I told you so, or whatever it might be. But if things aren't going the way they should be going, whether you're an athlete or a staff member or management or whoever it is, if you can honestly look yourself in the mirror and say, well, am I doing what I should be doing, and am I contributing to the solution, or am I contributing to the problem? And if you're more contributing to the problem, well, then I think you need to look at what you're doing for yourself first, and that actually may be nothing to fix. And then if you're not doing that, then you probably earn the right to challenge those within the group that you're working with to solve whatever problem it is, that you can then say, well, okay, this clearly isn't working. This is how I perceive to be contributing to the problem or solution. Give me some feedback. Are you the same? So that's probably I think one of the best ways to go about it. But in order to do that, as I said before, you need to be very comfortable with what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you need to be very comfortable being vulnerable and comfortable being uncomfortable as well.
Mm. And on the flip side, like for athletes where you want them to be more adaptable from their, from a playing perspective, what are some of your favorite methods or philosophies in terms of building adaptability in athletes from a physical point of view?
I think a large part of that is cognitive development, to be perfectly honest, and developing the critical thinking skills to, again, solve any problem that they're faced with. And a part of that, I think, actually starts very early on in development spaces, when coaches, I'm talking tactical coaches, we teach athletes to play a certain way, whatever the sport is, rather than identifying what their strengths and weaknesses, whether it be physical or tactical, are concerned, and building a game model or a performance model to suit that. I think we have, say, benchmarks or KPIs that we identify athletes with because we want them to fit a particular system and structure. But the great ones are the 99th percentile that don't fit the model but stand out because they do something very unique. So I think as coaching staff or as performance support staff, our role there is to create environments that facilitate critical thinking and decision making, but also in doing that, allow for mistakes as well, and then allow for pressure to be built and allow for it to be purposeful pressure. I think often where athletes crumble is when they're faced with situations where obviously that they're not used to, and you hear it in commentary all the time. It's a pressure situation, and how do you train and prepare for that? So being specific and purposeful and training with intent is a big piece of that, in my opinion. But yeah, creating situations that are strategically designed to evoke a bit of a struggle, I think, is a big piece of that then too. And then that's obviously a collaborative process with your whole coaching staff that are involved, and whether that's in pre-season, in season, and it could be very, very simple with late game scenario. It could be, a manipulation of athletes that you're working with or that you're opposing against each other, so that some are, it's going to be a biased outcome, and how do the underdogs handle it, and so on and so forth. But there's some, I think when you put coaches in a room, and if that's the goal, then there'll be some really good creativity that flows and ideas and ways in which you can create those things.
And how much of that do you think is planned from a coach's perspective? Like, is that this session's going to be, we're going to challenge the athletes all the time. If the drill's being done too well, we're going to make it harder. Or, is it something that you periodize through blocks, or is it something that is a bit more individual, maybe with athletes that you think are already really elite? They've been doing it for quite some time, so it's more something that you're just constantly sort of challenging that individual player.
I think it depends on where the athletes are at. Obviously, like if you've got younger athletes, there's still that element of learning to train, and learning what the basics and fundamentals are. And then as the athletes become more successful, then they're more in tune with their bodies and the outcomes that they're working towards, and they should actually be able to challenge us. So you can be strategic then in periodizing it in certain ways, but just through observation in some training sessions. And I can give a specific example from a water polo training session the other day. Like, there was a 5-minute drink break, and the girls just started a game, a scoring game that the coach then loved because it was specifically relating to late game outcome and a man down in defense, or a woman down in defense, sorry. And that then became a drill. So I think when you give, in that case, you gave the athletes just naturally had some freedom and some creativity, and the coach saw it, embraced it, and pushed the rest of the training plan away. Ironically, it was actually still the last drill of the session was a late game scenario, so it kind of fit anyway. But she was able to pivot and identify that what the athletes were doing was actually still purposeful and was going to meet the goal, and embraced it and actually got those athletes to run that drill. So that problem solving, critical thinking skill set, you're developing that at the same time, rather than just teaching and coaching for the sake of coaching, but creating situations where the athletes coach themselves and have to solve those problems for those scenarios.
And have you touched on before how important purpose and intent is? Like, does the intent and purpose of the drill, when it's come from within, go up a notch, like in terms of engagement when it's come from the athletes?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, just subjectively, just watching, I think that if you've created something, I think it's just kind of natural for you to do that. And also, like, just a change of voice is quite nice too. So when the athletes see that someone's developed something, but the coach also supports that, like that's a big piece of that. If the coach was in that situation was to, push it aside and say, no, that's not what we're doing, and not have the bigger picture in mind, you maybe crush that for the sake of crushing it. So yeah, definitely. I think that when you can facilitate that in your athletes, then they're probably going to be able to do it, like when it matters as well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And going back to strength and conditioning staff, for those that perhaps need to work on their adaptability and maybe aren't aware of it yet, when you're leading teams, what are some ways that you can try and build that awareness or improve adaptability in staff?
I think it's developed from life experience and also like on job as well. I think as kids, as teenagers, as young adults, I said you got to develop those critical thinking skills, and there's master's programs in high performance sport that are specifically aimed at developing those thinking skill sets. It's like being accustomed to being faced with adversity and being tested both formally and informally, in my opinion. And you could do that through a number of different ways. Traveling and going and throwing yourself into different non-English speaking countries and working out a ways to order coffee, order food, pay for things that you're not accustomed to doing. And early on, perhaps maybe taking calculated risks, but they're not comfortable, because it's very difficult to embrace change and embrace adversity, and you have to maybe lean into the uncomfortable. So if it's a calculated risk, I think it's an easy way to do it. Having that experiential learning cycle, I think there's really important too. We have to experience something, reflect on it, reflect and think on it, and then act. And that's where it obviously becomes heuristic. And then I think as young staff, you should be able to challenge your senior people or your HPMs to provide environments that you're unable to do that. I think rightfully or wrongfully, we traditionally look at them as practitioners with great hard skill sets and an application of certain philosophies. But the great ones that I've worked with, they just sit back and facilitate those learning experiences strategically and naturally, and allow the staff to make those mistakes, to know that they're probably going to solve it 10 times better next one. And I think the key word with that job title is like, you're a manager, not a practitioner. And we associate that often with managing say, the athlete or the program, but we need to remember that those people are responsible for managing staff. So as a young practitioner, if you don't feel like that your performance manager is actually managing you and helping you develop, then you should be able to challenge them on that. And I think that's a key responsibility in those HPM's roles. But then once you face with that, embrace it and act on it. Don't just ask for feedback and ask for challenge. When if you don't go on and do it, well then, you probably don't have a right to hold that role, in my opinion. But I think that's a key part of it. And there's obviously a lot of mistakes that you can make, but being able to identify those is pretty critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, mate, for sharing. It's such a interesting topic to dive into, and something that no matter if you're an athlete or a staff member in sport, you can apply it to anything, or even if you're a business owner, anything in life, I think it can transfer. So appreciate you coming on and discussing that in great detail, mate. We'll start to move into the wrapping up the show. This is more some personal questions, a bit of a lighter touch on the podcast, but pet peeves, mate, in your working life. Do you have anything that fires you up or annoys you?
It's a good question, but I don't know if I've got any specific sort of pet peeves. I think if I could maybe change one thing, it would be in my current role. It would be the time that these athletes have. Like, they do you got athletes that they work full-time jobs, they study, they have school for some of them. They are in the pool for 14, 16 hours a week, plus gym sessions. Like, they have a full-time training load. I would love it if these athletes that have amazing attitudes and approaches to training, and they do it all with a purpose, like if they were professional, I would love to see their physical, technical capacities just go through the roof. So it's not and that's obviously a constraint of the environment that we work in, but I would love to be able to see that change. I think you would just see the level of athletes that we produce just go from here to here. But a dirty gym is always one thing that grinds my gears a little bit, and I got to admit, I got called out on that the other day here. I left a K box out and also left something else out that I then owed the staff coffees for, and that was fine. But dirty gym or putting things back in the wrong places, and bumpers versus just those little things. I'm OCD with that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yep. And what about favorite way to spend your day off?
I've got more of them now, so I can answer that question. Make good coffee, 100%. Either beach or golf course, and then undoubtedly the day would have to finish with a great restaurant with my wife. 100%. We're both foodies, so going and spending time and devouring some type of elaborate meal would be high on the list for the day.
Yep. And we're coming to a close for 2022. So it's sort of a hybrid question, but what's the festive season look like for you, wrapping up the year, but also what's on the horizon for 2023? What are you excited about for next year?
A festive season, I'm really looking forward to just being able to spend a Christmas with my family for the first time in 4 years. That's going to be, and I think for most people too, obviously with COVID having destroyed travel and everything. So, but not being home to celebrate Christmas with either my family or my wife's family for the past 4 years. So that's going to be very exciting. 2023, the big thing for me is undoubtedly the birth of my first child, expecting late January, early February. So that's going to be...
congratulations.
Thank you. Awesome, that's undoubtedly going to be the highlight personally, but then professionally, being a part of the preparation for Paris in 2024 is going to be a big thing. At NSwiss, we're undertaking a huge strength science journey and upskilling professionally with all facets of strength and power, and 8 key elements of what strength science actually is. So being involved in that and getting to discuss some of the best practitioners in the world, their philosophies, and bring them in and talk to us and our staff is has been and will continue to be a huge thing. And then also about to start a PhD. So very,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Pandemic.
very much looking forward to getting into all of that. But as I said before, the big cake there is the family and kids on the way. So can't wait for that.
Yeah, wrapped for you, mate. There's plenty exciting things on the horizon for you. So that sounds like an awesome year next year, and good to be able to share it with loved ones and enjoy the festive season, particularly if it's been 4 years for you, mate. So wrapped to hear that. In terms of someone who hasn't worked in institutes, so it's probably a selfish question, but also for all those that haven't worked in it as well. You mentioned Alex Tyrrell, Simon Harris, and yourself. So how does that sort of look? What type of athletes do you guys look over a year basis, and how do you manage the institute with where there's 3 managers, if you like, or head of departments?
So great question. And obviously, like, institutes are perceived as very integral parts and governing bodies of the Australian sporting landscape, and will undoubtedly play a more prominent role as we move towards Brisbane in 2032. NSWIS specifically has 450 scholarship athletes. So as a performance support staff, Alex Natera's responsibility is he sits across the major disciplines of sports science, biomechanics, physiology, and strength conditioning. And then beneath him will be a number of heads of departments. Simon Harris is head of strength conditioning. There's head of physiology, head of movement science, which encompasses biomechanics, performance analysis, and then performance health, which is physio, is separate to him. And then as S&Cs, Simon doesn't have any direct responsibility as far as programming for athletes is concerned. We have 11 full-time strength conditioning coaches. So as I said, I'm one of 3 seniors who have only one sporting responsibility. So I'm responsible for the delivery of the water polo program. Our other 2 seniors are responsible for the rowing at one at the National Training Centre, and then the other is for archery, both para and able-bodied. And then the rest of our S&C staff are responsible for the other Olympic programs that are held here at NSWIS. That includes winter sport, cycling, martial arts through taekwondo, boxing, track and field, diving. It's a very large program here. I'm sure hockey is another very large one with the National Training Centre in Perth. I'm sure I've missed some others as well, but your role can be delineated into looking after a number of sports or just after one, depending on number of athletes, support from the National Sporting Organisation, and also medal likelihood as well. That does factor into how much support some sports provided. Other institutes, QAS, VIS, WACE, ACTAS, like SASI, they all have different sports allocated. So again, like the National Training Centre for cycling is actually in South Australia. So the Australian athletes, or the national representatives, will be based out of there. The NSWIS program is a TID pathway to get to the South Australian setup. Water polo that I'm working with is decentralised. So half the athletes are in Queensland, half of them are here at NSWIS. So sailing is an embedded program, so they'll train at Middle Harbour. That's a big one here as well. But again, the NSWIS program supports the national program. So there's a lot of staff as S&Cs. We work primarily on the strength side of things, with the physiologist doing the conditioning or physiology support. Yep. And that's one very unique thing, I guess, that in a pro setting, you're kind of a jack of all trades, and then you throw rehab into that then too, where you have to have a bit of skill acquisition, performance analysis, S&C, with emphasis on both the S and the C side of things. Whereas here, you can kind of put your blinkers on a little bit and focus just on the strength and power side of things, because you do have physiology support, movement science in biomech, performance analysis, skill acquisition. So you've got great experts in those areas that you can bounce ideas off and have some really good conversations with to solve problems. And at the recent NIN conference in the Gold Coast, we actually had a problem-a-thon where coaches came in and would have a specific problem, and each sort of we would break up into different disciplines and talk about ways in which we would tackle them. And so as staff, continuing to develop our critical thinking skills there, that's great.
Yeah. Thanks, mate. Thanks for such a thorough insight to how it all works. And sounds like a great space to be working in, a great environment for the athletes as well. For those that want to ask any follow-up questions from today's chat, mate, is there a best place to get in contact with yourself?
Yeah, for sure. All the socials, LinkedIn is probably one of the easiest to get a hold of me. Twitter, I think my handle's at Nate Spencer. I think Instagram is performance_coach_Spencer from memory. I'm not huge on there, but I will reply. But probably the easiest way is just LinkedIn. I would say is the best way to get in touch. If anyone's got any questions or wants to talk shop about anything, I'm more than happy to. So yeah, please drop me a line, and always just continuing to develop our network and collab and talk, and yeah, just everyone improving.
Yeah, awesome, mate. That's fantastic. I appreciate it. We'll add those links for those listening in that might be driving. We'll add them in the show notes. So yeah, thanks again, Nathan, for jumping on and sharing with us your time and experience in elite sport, and more importantly around adaptability and how important it is if you want to have a sustainable career in elite sport, as well as from an athlete's perspective as well for high performance. So really appreciate your time, mate. And looking forward to what the rest of your career, following you closely, will entail. And for those that tuned in halfway through, make sure to listen to the very start. This episode will live on our YouTube channel until we publish it on our podcast platform. Our next live chat won't be for some time, as I'm going overseas for a period. So we'll be with Vern Gambetta on the Thursday, the 19th of January. So make sure to pencil that one in, as it'll be another fantastic chat. So I'll see you guys all then.